Hello, everybody, and welcome. Your Excellencies, dear participants, I have the pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research and our co-organizer, the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs. My name is Paula Sumaya-Domit. I'm an associate researcher at UNIDIR, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. This third and final webinar in our series, it was made possible by the generous support of Germany. These webinars are intended to support stakeholders with their substantive preparation on 3 issue areas within the mandate of the Open-Ended Technical Expert Group in the context of the UN Programme of Action, which will meet in June in New York. The first webinar, held in October, provided participants with an overview of marking, tracing, and record-keeping issues related to polymer and modular small arms components. The second webinar, held in mid-December, discussed the issue of craft production, and particularly in relation to new technologies such as 3D printing. We're hoping that this last webinar strikes a more hopeful note. We'll be discussing new technologies, not in terms of the challenges they pose, but rather the opportunities that they give us specifically to prevent arms diversion. These webinars aim to share the current state of knowledge on these specific issues. And to summarize the discussion, if you missed one of them, the recordings are available on UNIDIR's website, but we'll also be publishing a primer in the coming months in advance of the OETEG on the same subjects. Today's discussion will last an hour and 30 minutes and will be conducted fully in English. We'll be hearing from an excellent panel of experts that has joined us today, and then we'll open for Q&A. So please note that throughout the entire webinar, you're welcome to use the Q&A function, leave your questions in the chat, and after the 4 presentations, we'll be taking some of these questions and directing them to the panelists. Should you encounter any technical challenges during the webinar, my colleague May Bayena is online. You can reach her through our CAP UNIDIR person here in the webinar, or we'll put her email in the chat as well. I'd like to open the discussion first by turning to our co-organizers, specifically Mr. Ivor Fung, Chief of the Conventional Arms Branch at UNODA, for some opening remarks. They've been our co-organizers through this process, so it's a joy to begin with them. With that, Ivor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. My name is Ivor Richard Fung. I'm the Chief of the Conventional Arms Branch at the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. And as you all know, as Paula has said, this is the last of a series of webinars. But my role is just to say a few words to welcome you. But let me start by acknowledging the financial support of the government of Germany, which has made this series possible. I also would like to thank our partners, the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, for co-organizing the webinars. And of course, a warm thanks to our speakers for sharing their expertise with us today. We have less than 4 months until states and other stakeholders meet in New York for the 9th biennial meeting of states on the UN Programme of Action and the inaugural meeting of the Open-Ended Technical Expert Group. The OETEG will develop recommendations by no later than 2030 on tackling the challenges and also seizing the opportunities of development in small arms technology, manufacturing, and design for the full implementation of the PoA and the international tracing instruments. The discussions on new and emerging technologies have a long history in the meetings of the PoA. In fact, I would say since the adoption of the ITI itself in 2005. And technical discussion stretched back to the meeting of governmental experts which took place in 2011 and 2015. I'm pleased to announce that on 4 February, all UN member states endorsed the permanent representative of Sierra Leone, Ambassador Michael Kanu, as chair designate of the open-ended technical expert group. Ambassador Kanu could not join us today due to previously scheduled travels. He intends to hold an interactive preparatory process, including formal consultations with state and briefings with other stakeholders. The chair designate will, of course, work in close collaboration with BMS 9 and its chair designate, Ambassador James Larson of Australia, to ensure a successful 2026 meeting. I also would like to highlight that states have been encouraged to bring technical experts to the OETEG and to include them in their delegations as much as possible. And the chair designate can invite briefings by experts from the private sector, civil society, and academia. He also welcomes working papers and other contributions. Importantly, the collective expertise in this virtual room and the discussion during this entire webinar series are a direct contribution to the OETEG in June. The previous 2 webinars focused on the challenges posed by new and emerging technologies. To finish the series on a more positive note, today's webinar focuses on how new technologies and innovations can mitigate or prevent the risks of diversion and illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. I recall that through the outcome document of the fourth review conference of the PoA, states have recognized the opportunities associated with technology to improve practices and reduce the cost of marking, record keeping and tracing, stockpile management and security, as well as the destruction of small arms in surplus. So the issue with new technology is not all that negative. There is a possibility to look into how we can turn them to good use. And that is specifically why we are here today to explore some of the ways. And I can tell you, member states are looking forward to that, how they could learn from the opportunities that new technology can offer in this process. Today, we are joined by an expert panel that will help us to better understand these opportunities. I wish you all a very successful webinar, and I look forward to a rich and insightful discussion. I will now hand back to you, Paula. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivor, for that positive note. Hopefully, we can move into these opportunities now. With this, I'd like to turn to our first speaker in the substantive part of our discussion. Sarah Clément is a researcher across UNIDIR's Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program and our Security and Technology Program. She'll set the scene on different technologies and applications available for the prevention of diversion, walking us through the findings of her project, which was done in collaboration with the Flemish Peace Institute, which provides a methodology for states to evaluate how they can implement these technologies themselves. I think it'll be the perfect starting point for our discussion. With that, Sarah, I'll turn over to you.
Many thanks, Paula, for the introduction, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a pleasure to be amongst you today. So there will be some slides coming up. Oh, thank you so much, May, for sharing the slides. And as mentioned, I'll be sharing some findings as to the opportunities that technologies might offer to counter the diversion of small arms and light weapons. And as mentioned, this is based on a joint research endeavor that we undertook with the Flemish Peace Institute between 2022 and 2024. Next slide, please. You might, of course, be wondering, why should we examine the use of technologies to counter diversion, especially as there already exists a number of initiatives and measures that have been developed at national, regional, and international levels to counter the diversion of conventional weapons more widely, as well as small arms and light weapons specifically. And these initiatives are primarily non-technological in nature. And despite their existence, we are still faced with the issue of diversion. So through our research, we wanted to explore whether and how technology can help complement these existing initiatives and measures. And it's quite interesting because in the commercial and industrial sectors, there already are a number of technologies which are used to ensure the security of legitimate trade flows, and from which we can draw out lessons learned and identify potential transferable technologies and lessons. And that's not to say that within the arms and transfer control domain, there have not been discussions or use of technologies. There has, but there nonetheless remains a gap between kind of this increased attention and interest in the technology and perhaps the understanding and the use of it for counter-diversion purposes. So part of our aim was also to raise awareness and to increase the knowledge base as to this possibility, and also perhaps explore a bit more as to why this gap exists between interest and practice. Next slide, please. So although I'll be talking about how the technology can help, I do want to mention that it isn't a panacea, and I'll be exploring this a bit further in my presentation. But nonetheless, I think it's important to understand that technology is not some sort of miracle solution, and on its own, it cannot fix all current and future challenges regarding illicit trade of small arms and light weapons. And technology can become an issue in and of itself if applied poorly. Or if I were to use a metaphor, applied as a hammer, as if everything was a nail. So in other words, we can't rely on tech to fix every problem. And that is why I want to introduce a framework that we developed as part of our research to consider how and when to best think about technology use or consider use of technology. This is a three-step approach where the first step first determines what actually is the issue. So what are the risks of diversion that we are encountering? These obviously are different depending on what type of weapons we're talking about, and they're different according to different contexts. So this is first of all trying to understand what is the issue. And once we have that data, once we've identified the problem, the second step examines what are the solutions and what existing technologies could potentially help either prevent or overcome the identified risk or risks emerging from the first step. And the third and final step assesses whether the identified technologies are applicable depending on the context that they are applied to, as well as specific attributes that the technologies should ideally possess. I'm not going to go into this framework into too much detail. I'm happy to come back to it during the Q&A. But what I really want to show is that the implementation of technology should be needs-driven and context-sensitive. So while in the next slides I will talk about technology specifically, I do want you to bear that in mind. So on this current slide, as you can see, there's a range of technologies that we examined through our research. And the particularity of these technologies is that they have either already been used to some extent in the area of counter-diversion of weapons, or have been employed in kind of the civilian commercial realms. So in other words, they are known technologies from which we could draw out lessons and experiences of use. And the list that you see on the screen is by no means exhaustive, but attempts to cover a range of different technologies that have a range of purposes. So you will see on the screen, or maybe you can't, it's a bit small, but you can zoom in perhaps. It's also in a report, which I will share a link to later. But they can enable tracking and tracing, item level identification, anti-tampering, data analysis, and more. And they also vary in terms of their complexity. And as part of the research, we didn't just do kind of mapping of what technology exists, but we also talked to experts which had knowledge on a range of different issues, including arms control, international trade flows, and counter-diversion, to assess these different technologies. And their inputs really helped understand and explore to what extent these individual technologies could have an impact on counter-diversion efforts for small arms light weapons, as well as what barriers exist to their successful implementation. So on the next slide, there's just a few a bit of some framing or some context. We weren't just examining the impact and barriers for each technology, but also within specific parts of the life cycle of small arms light weapons, as well as what we called elements of counter-diversion. So we assessed the relevance of technology across pre-export, transfer, and post-delivery, as well, given that the risks and the methods of diversion differ between these stages. And we were quite interested in understanding whether and how the different life cycle stages might impact the relevance of different technologies. We then also distinguished between three different elements that comprised counter-diversion. So we simplified this for the purpose of the research and analysis. And we differentiated this according to the goals and the stage of the occurrence of an incident. So this allowed us to explore whether there are any differences in the ability for different technologies to aid with either preventing, detecting, or identifying instances of diversion. So on the next slide, I present some selected findings. There are a lot of findings, so I had to handpick a few to share with you today. The first one is that of the 14 technologies that we assessed, all were assessed to have potential relevance in helping counter the diversion of small arms light weapons. The benefits outlined by the participating experts were wide-ranging and include the fact that technology can help improve knowledge of unknowns through better use of data, help overcome space and time constraints, as well as some of them were time-consuming and physical nature of some of the elements, such as post-shipment verification. On the next slide, please. Here we can see maybe a more detailed analysis. Don't worry about trying to understand the graphic. It's really just illustrative. And here is just to show kind of how we examine some of this data. Really the key takeaway from this is the types of technologies that the participants identified as most relevant tended to differ on the life cycle stage. So not every technology is most appropriate depending if you're looking into pre-export, transfer, or post-delivery. In a similar vein, the relevance of technologies in aiding with specific counter-diversion elements, so prevention, detection, and identification, also differed. And most of the assessed technologies were actually found to be better suited to detecting diversion while it is occurring or after it has occurred, as opposed to preventing it, which really shows how technology can help work with other existing mechanisms. Next slide, please. The participating experts also identified the technologies as facing certain barriers. These, for the most part, were not seen as insurmountable barriers, but of the different types of barriers that were presented to the experts, infrastructure and cost were seen to pose perhaps the highest barriers to successful implementation of the technologies, whereas ethical and social requirements were perceived as posing the lowest amount of barriers. And this finding was consistent across the stages of pre-export, transfer, and post-delivery. And as you can see, if you can just go back one, thank you. As you can see from the slide, we were able to map the technologies according to both their perceived impact on counter-diversion versus their overall score regarding barriers to implementation, so a barriers versus impact analysis. And most of the technologies, well, actually all of the technologies fell on the upper two quadrants. So high impact, low barriers, and high impact, higher barriers. And most specifically, the technologies assessed as having a higher impact while facing lower barriers include document authentication, e-seals, RFIDs, and to a lesser extent, 2D codes and NFCs. And despite these scores, I should, however, emphasize that the choice of a specific technology should be based on need and context. So really referring back to the framework I presented at the start. And therefore, although we present this graph, we don't recommend a specific technology or a specific combination of technologies to help counter diversion. It's also important to take these findings or this kind of graphical representation of the findings alongside some of the more qualitative assessments provided by the experts, which, for example, discuss some things which are very difficult to represent through graphical representation, such as issues with suitability, error rates in the technology, trust, risk. So it's very important that when you look at these findings, you also look into kind of the narrative that's included in our report. So as an example, 2D codes were discussed at length by our experts. And indeed, here you can see that they show perhaps lower barriers to implementation. So it may be at first glance very kind of attractive technology, but when we discussed it in further detail with our experts, there were questions raised as to whether this actually added value when adopting it, especially when compared to other technologies, which perhaps face slightly higher barriers, but could fulfill the same or similar purposes and have additional functions. And all of these reflections are included in the report. And due to time, I won't go into this further unless you ask me specific questions at Q&A stage. I want to go to the next slide now to just highlight some specific systemic barriers which were brought up and which may prevent wider adoption and implementation of the technologies, as that is also an important factor when considering technology use. And it's also quite interesting to consider these, especially versus the fact that a lot of the kind of interest and positive impact that were mentioned with regards to potential technology use. And of course, the type and extent of each barrier can differ depending on the stakeholder, but there are 7 areas which emerged in particular throughout the discussion, as you can see on the slide. And unsurprisingly, mirroring what I mentioned before, cost is a recurring issue when it comes to some of these barriers and perhaps reluctance to adopt the technology. Because when we talk about cost, we're not just talking about one-time, one-off cost of purchasing the technology, but training, personnel, maintenance, replacement of elements, and kind of this enabling ecosystem. I won't go further into the other barriers, but I also want to talk about what we explored in terms of possible avenues to overcome some of these barriers. The report provides some non-exhaustive list of options and avenues, and these are categorized across different clusters. One that I particularly want to highlight is the need to strengthen collaboration and interagency cooperation, such as by using pre-existing forums and multilateral instruments as a means to share knowledge and build capacity on these issues, namely because of its relevance to the OETEG, which could act as one such forum. Overall, the findings show that successful application of technology relies on certain building blocks, such as oversight, an enabling environment, the enforcement of frameworks, instruments, and processes, as well as on broader political will. And these building blocks are, of course, relevant to counter-diversion efforts more broadly, not just specific to technology use, but nonetheless a point well worth highlighting. I'll stop here just to mention that on the next slide, you can use a QR code to access the reports. Happy to share the links as well. And of course, very happy to answer any questions you may have during Q&A. Thank you so much for your patience, and back over to you, Paula.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that gives us a great start to the discussion, especially emphasizing this methodological step-by-step approach to implementation. I think we've all seen many cases in which someone just says AI is going to solve everything, or just implement this technology and everything will be fixed. So it's nice to have this grounded approach of how to take these steps forward. Thank you so much. With that, and many thanks to Sarah, I'm going to turn the floor over to Pierangeli De Luca, who is head of section at the Conventional Arms, Munition, and Explosives section within the Organization of American States. Pierre will provide us a regional perspective on the OAS's experiences on how technology can be used to implement diversion. So the floor is yours, Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone participating. It's a great pleasure to contribute to this series. And I would like to start thanking UNIDIR and ODA for this kind invitation for us to be able to present some of the information technology tools that we're developing here at the Organization of American States to support Latin American and Caribbean countries. So I have a presentation to share. Just give me 1 minute. Hopefully you can see it by now. Perfect. Thanks for confirming. So we're going to take a little turn from what Sarah has presented in a sense that we are kind of going backwards to more traditional and not so new technology. What we've been doing here is using information technology tools, so it's not as innovative of what Sarah presented to us, but of course it's something that can be used in combination to what Sarah has presented. And why we're doing this, it's because most or a lot of our member states and countries in the region are still using paper-based systems. So even though it is a traditional type of technology, there is still a gap and a need to digitize some of these processes. So the support that we are offering to the countries, it's based on the framework of our Program of Assistance and Control of Arms and Munition, PACAM, through which we offer capacity building and technical assistance support to OAS member states with the goal of reducing armed violence, particularly for the implementation of the CIFTA Convention. So there are a number of activities in capacity building that we offer to the countries. You can see in the screen some of them, but I want to focus on the information technology tools that has a double goal. Counter diversion through strengthening of the national capacities and also through fostering regional coordination. We have so far developed 4 tools. So we have the inventory control software for firearms and ammunition that it's known by its acronym in Spanish, SAM. We also launched the National Licensing System, SNL. We are developing the Regional Communication Mechanism on Illicit Transfers of Firearms and Ammunition, MCTA, and we have launched the Firearms and Ammunition Knowledge Platform. I don't have the time to detail a little more of the Firearms and Ammunition Knowledge Platform, but this is a centralized repository of information regarding firearms trafficking in the Americas. So it's where our member states are going to be able to provide information for the biannual CIFTA report with automatic interactive dashboards where they will be able to self-assess how they are complying with the convention. And it's also a public repository of information where you'll have access to CIFTA standards through like intelligent search tool, as well as digital library. So I invite everyone to access the Firearms and Ammunition Knowledge Platform to see more of it. I'm going to focus on the 3 first tools, starting with the inventory control software. That is the first one that we developed in 2020, and a 2.0 version was launched in 2023. And the inventory control software is essential, a specialized tool to promote inventory control of firearms and ammunition within national stockpiles. It can be installed and it can be used by any type of institution that has stockpiles. So currently it's being utilized by 50 institutions across 10 countries, the majority of which are either police forces or armed forces branch, but there are also other type of institutions that are responsible for instance, keeping stockpiles of seized firearms that are using the software. The software was developed because, as I said, we mapped that there is a gap in the region, and a lot of these institutions that has significant stockpiles are still using paper-based systems or Excel sheets, which has a lot of limitations for reporting, for accountability, and for monitoring of the stockpiles to prevent diversion. The SAM was built with open source coding, considering that a lot of our states have limited resources, and that was an alternative to be able to have system sustainability, as countries don't have to pay licenses, and also country ownership of the data. This software can be installed locally, either on servers, on networks, or simply on workstations. A lot of our countries don't have the capabilities to have all the depot areas connected, for instance. So we are building blocks. So we start with implementing the software on a workstation on a specific depot area, so we can digitize that process. We can work with the personnel that is working there so they can get familiar with the software, and slowly we can build a more integrated infrastructure. The countries own the data, so it's all installed locally. The OES doesn't have access to that information. The system counts with all the security features necessary, like multi-layer security protocols, two-factor authentication, auditable logs, multi-level users, and it's available both in Spanish and English. In terms of the core functionalities, I don't think there is anything quite new here. It's an inventory control software, so it allows for the tracking of physical descriptions, locations, the current condition of arms and ammunition. So particularly with ammunition, it will issue automated alerts to the authorities when ammunition is about to expire, so they can take the necessary measures regarding that ammunition that it's going to expire. It allows for full oversight of movement tracking, so entry and exit of firearms and ammunition, external transfers, assignment to officers, and then it will also generate alerts in case there is anything that it's suspicious in the assignment or in that movement. And it has monitoring analytics capacities, so there's a dedicated module for generating reports and statistics. The other focus that we have is particularly on export control, and that will have two dimensions, at the national level and at the regional level. On the regional level, we are developing the MCTA, which is the Regional Communication Mechanism on Illicit Transfers of Firearms and Ammunition. And that was a request from the SIFTA state parties. For those that are unfamiliar with the SIFTA Convention, it was the first regional agreement to counter the illicit manufacture and trafficking of firearms, ammunition, and explosives. 31 countries of the 35 in the Americas have ratified SIFTA. So it's a convention that basically it's a legally binding convention for most of the Americas. So the SIFTA state parties requested us to develop the MCTA, so it's grounded on the obligations of the convention. But basically, the MCTA, we also enable countries to implement not only the SIFTA convention, but also dispositions, for instance, of the Arms Trade Treaty. So it's aligned to those dispositions. And the MCTA, it's going to be a secure web-based platform to facilitate real-time communication between licensing authorities, with the possibility of triangulating that information also with transshipment countries and with the customs authorities. And why we are developing the MCTA beyond the request of the SIFTA state parties, of course, to bridge the information silo. So what it was saying is that there is a lack of real-time verification that increased the risk of diversion to the illicit markets of some of those transfers. And you can see in the screen some of the statistics from a regional mapping that it was carried out at the beginning of the process. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we found out. So for instance, 82% of the countries do not share information on license denials, and 75% of the countries do not notify other countries involved in the process about license revocations, which means that any ill-intended individual can use expired or revoked licenses in a process without the other authority knowing about it. Transit countries have stated over and over that they rely primarily on transport operators to obtain information. So they are not fully involved in the process, even though the SIFTA Convention obliges the countries to notify also transit and transshipment authorities. Nearly 50% of received confirmations have no response. So even when countries of origin require a received confirmation, they half of the time don't receive a received confirmation. So the MCTA really tries to close those gaps and facilitate the real-time communication through standardized information and ensuring that each country involved in that process will have immediate access to the information and to verify documentation. So the functionalities of the MCTA, it's going to be able, as I said, to issue real-time alerts. So automated notifications will be sent to all the states that are involved in the transfer about a license that it was issued, that it was denied, that it was revoked, delivery confirmations. It would also allow authorities to formulate direct queries, questions on transfer process in real time so they can have that communication flow. And it will include a voluntary risk management repository. And for the purpose of what we're discussing in today's session, I think that's a key thing to be highlighted. So the voluntary risk management repository, it's going to be a voluntary exchange of information about any data that states consider that could prevent future diversion by enhancing the risk analysis of the countries. So that's not going to be information that is shared only between the specific countries participating in a transfer. It will be shared to all the community, all the actors that are participating in the system about diversion cases, illicit route alerts, cancel, deny licenses, like the reasons why a state decides to cancel or deny a license, a list of unauthorized operators. All that information is voluntary, so it will depend on the national authority having that decision making process of what could be useful for other countries to shed light in their risk analysis process. Of course, each country is sovereign, so because a country denied transfer process, that does not mean that the other country will have to deny it. No one is binding, but it's just a way of improving risk analysis in the region. It will also allow for easier transfer of information in terms of having a standardized way of sharing the information on the licenses. And what it was done is to work with equivalence tables, because we have different languages in the region, and even when countries use the same language, as we all know here, they have issues with how to classify and identify firearms particularly. So they will use different nomenclature, and what we are trying to do is standardize that through equivalence tables. When a country adheres to the system, we will work with the counterparts to be able to standardize what they are using and what the system will use as the standard. In terms of the architecture, is a decentralized system with data encryption. So countries have chosen to have a central server that is just a messenger. Only the countries that are involved in a specific transfer will have the key to decrypt and access the information. So the information will pass through country A to country B involved in that transfer, fully encrypted, as a way of ensuring that the information that we know it's quite sensitive and confidential does not leak to other actors. In terms of the development process, we carry out a 2-year design thinking process with SIFTA state parties, because there are many challenges in this process in terms of legislation, concerns with the framework, the use of IT. So it was a lengthy 2-year design thinking process with SIFTA state parties until they approved this design that I just mentioned here. And now we are working with the IT developers to develop the solution, the electronic solution, and we are start piloting that solution in the second semester of this year. So we can receive feedback from the countries, and we can make all the necessary adjustments. And then in 2027, we hope to launch officially the system and start its implementation and expansion with the necessary agreements with the countries that desire to participate. It's a voluntary system. Even though it was approved by SIFTA state parties, they are not binded to use it. But we hope that when they see the benefits of it, they can use it, and with the potential of also including countries from outside the region, because we know the export-import flows are not limited within the Americas. So they are important export countries that are not in the region, and our member states have already mentioned the importance of trying to include those countries as well. And finally, in this process of focusing more on export control, another gap that became very clear is, especially for countries to participate in the regional mechanism, is the absence of electronic tools at the national level. So half of Latin American and Caribbean countries are still using paper-based systems or Excel to manage their import-export licensing process. So the need for an electronic tool became quite clear, so they could participate in the regional mechanism, as well as for them to have better control of the licensing process. And that's why we developed the national license system that it was launched in April 2025. The national licensing system is a comprehensive software for managing the authorization process of export, import, and transit of small arms and light weapons and ammunition. It has very similar characteristics to the inventory control software in a sense that it was developed with open source coding. It is deployed locally, either in servers, networks, or workstations, precisely because those became very big lessons learned from the inventory control software of how we could build sustainability, especially in low resource contexts. Security also has end-to-end encryption, multi-level user roles. It's available both in English and Spanish, and it was developed in a flexible way that the platform is easily adaptable to operational and legal requirements of each country without the need of going to the coding and further developing the software. So it has that flexibility that lower the cost of deployment and adaptation to each specific country. So the core functionalities of the national licensing system is to allow management of end-to-end licensing applications from submission to final approval, denial, revocation. It also integrates logistics, so you can keep track of the movement of the goods. So you have the capability for integrating that with the national customs procedures. If customs already have their own systems, the softwares can be integrated through an API. If customs don't have a specific software, customs can also be integrated within the SNL with their own platform. It allows for centralized records. So essentially you have a unified database for all these processes, which facilitates national reporting, either for the country own analysis, as well as to comply with reporting obligations of the ATT, for instance. So those are the three solutions that I wanted to focus on today. And just in terms of our experience implementing and designing those solutions, we have some key conclusions. And I think some of them are much aligned with what Sarah just presented before me. I think first and foremost, technology is an enabler, is not a fix. So it's installing the software, it's only the first step and perhaps the easy step. The true challenge and the true deterrent to diversion is streamlining national processes, is to be able to develop the capacities of the operators on how to use technology and what are the processes that should be in place. So for us to install, for instance, the inventory control software, it's only going to be useful if the operators that are in that specific depot area comply with the processes, the control, the standard operating procedures of how they should register information of entry and exit, what are the risks that they should consider when they are securing transportation, the logistics. So the technology is just to facilitate streamlining those processes, but it is necessary to have comprehensive and long-term technical assistance so we can develop those capacities within national institutions. Also, the transition from manual paper-based systems to digital platforms cannot be, even though it seems like no technology, something that it's not quite new compared to what of the things that we're discussing nowadays, but it is still necessary, and it does eliminate some blind spots in the transfer chain. In terms of ownership and sustainability, specifically for the region, I think there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There are off-the-shelf softwares. There are softwares that are developed locally by the countries, and there are solutions like the ones that we are developing. And it really needs to be context-based to what are the best solutions for each country. In the region, for some of our low-resource states, open source, locally installed software seems to be the most sustainable solution. But it's quite important that we can keep this vision of full life cycle traceability and integration. So whenever the solutions do not cover the entire life cycle, it's very important that through APIs, through IT integrations, we can ensure that end-to-end oversight. So the solutions that I presented today, for instance, one focused on inventory control of national stockpiles, the other one focused on licensing, export, import licensing processes. And they do have to be integrated with other pieces of the life cycle. Otherwise, we're still going to keep the data on silos, and we are not going to be able to eliminate those blind spots in the transfer chain. And of course, that goes also beyond just the immediate identification of any diversion incidents, but there's this vision, this integration, the data-driven policy will allow us to have more statistics and the identification of patterns that allows us to have better understanding of what are those emerging illicit routes, those emerging illicit patterns on firearms trafficking, and what are the diversion risks. So it's not only about specific incidents, but also on how we can better have public policy to counter those gaps and those diversions throughout the life cycle. So with that, I end here, and I'm eager to continue this discussion on the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Piet. I think that really nicely complements what Sarah has said about assessing your needs, meeting states where they are, and developing solutions that make sense. I also like that you talked so much about regional ownership and ownership over the process and localizing it, which is, I think, a perfect segue to our next speaker. Silvia Paula Mendoza is Coordinator for Multidimensional Security in Mexico's Ministry for External Relations. Silvia Paula will be introducing a national perspective on the technology uses to prevent diversion in Mexico's cases. So I think it's wonderful to work our way from the regional perspective down to the national perspective. And with that, I will turn the floor to you, Silvia Paula.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us. I hope you can hear me well and see me well. Excellent. Thank you. So I would like to thank UNIDIR for convening this webinar and for the opportunity to close this series. As you have mentioned, this is kind of the positive close. So I would be happy to focus on that approach. So we think that technology can be not only used as a source of new challenges, but also as a tool that can be incorporated to strengthen arms control systems. This discussion is particularly timely because it allows us, as you have mentioned also, to shift the lens and to ask how technology can actively support national efforts to prevent the diversion of small arms and light weapons. From Mexico's perspective, technology should not only be understood as a standalone solution or a quick fix, but rather it is most effective when it complements existing legal frameworks, institutional coordination, and human capacity. In this sense, technology becomes an enabler of obligations already contained in international regional instruments, including the UN Program of Action and related cooperation frameworks. Mexico approaches diversion prevention from a life cycle perspective, recognizing that diversion can occur at multiple stages, from manufacture and marking to transfer, storage, use, and final disposal or destruction. While for our country, the challenge of diversion does not have the same scale or impact as illicit trafficking itself, we recognize that both phenomena are closely interconnected and must be addressed through an integrated and comprehensive approach. In this regard, technology must be needs-driven, context-sensitive, and embedded within systems rather than adopted simply because it is available. In practice, this has led Mexico to prioritize technologies that strengthen traceability, record-keeping, and information exchange, particularly in a region where illicit arms trafficking has a strong transnational dimension. Mexico has strengthened its national firearms registries by moving away from fragmented or paper-based systems towards centralized digital databases. These systems do not replace legal marking obligations, but they enhance accuracy, reduce human error, and allow for faster cross-checks when weapons are recovered in criminal investigations. Even relatively low complexity digital tools can significantly improve tracing outcomes when they are consistently applied and interoperable across institutions. A second area of interest for my country relates to physical security and stockpile management. We have emphasized the gradual incorporation of technical tools that support access control, inventory verification, and monitoring of storage facilities. Here, the added value of technology lies less in sophistication and more in predictability and accountability. Regularly updated digital inventories and monitoring mechanisms help detect discrepancies early and reinforce institutional responsibility. A third area where technology has made a practical difference is interagency coordination. Digital platforms and standardized data formats have facilitated more timely information exchange among civilian authorities, law enforcement agencies, customs, and prosecutorial services. This has strengthened both domestic coordination and international cooperation. At the same time, our experience has been shaped by clear awareness of the barriers to technological integration. One persistent challenge is sustainability. Technology requires long-term investment, not only in equipment, but also in maintenance, training, and institutional continuity. Without these elements, even well-designed systems risk becoming underused or obsolete. Another challenge relates to interoperability and trust. Uneven adoption of technology across institutions or jurisdictions can undermine its effectiveness, especially when concerns about data security and sovereignty limit information sharing. Finally, Mexico has been careful to avoid over-reliance on technology. Digital tools cannot compensate for weak legal frameworks, insufficient oversight, or lack of political will. For this reason, technology has been treated as a complement to, not a substitute for, robust regulatory institutional foundations. Despite these constraints, Mexico has observed clear benefits from the gradual integration of technology into arms control systems. These include improved traceability of weapons, earlier detection of irregularities, enhanced accountability within institutions, and stronger regional cooperation. These outcomes align closely with the recent discussions under the UN Program of Action, including preparations for the 9th Biennial Meeting of States, where many delegations, including Mexico, have emphasized the role of technology in preventing diversion throughout the entire life cycle of arms and light weapons. Mexico's experience also reflects the value of linking technology with regional cooperation frameworks. In Latin America and the Caribbean, important advances have been achieved under SIFTA-OAS, whose consultative committee and conference of states parties are currently chaired by Mexico. So I'm glad that I went after the OAS representative, Pierre. So most recently, the 31 states parties to SIFTA adopted a set of complementary voluntary instruments, including an operational procedures manual for the destruction of small arms and light weapons, and operational procedures manual on physical security and stockpile management of small arms and light weapons, as well as regional guidelines for the prevention of gender-based violence, committed with the use of firearms in our region. While these documents are not technological tools per se, they provide a practical framework within which technology can support standardized record keeping, safer stockpile management, improved traceability, and more reliable data collection, thereby reinforcing control systems and reducing the risk of diversion in a concrete and context-sensitive manner. So to us, this is an example of what I referred to at the beginning, which is that technology can be a complement to existing mechanisms and law enforcement mechanisms, as well as documents such as the ones that I just mentioned. From our perspective, technology can help shift arms control efforts from a reactive posture to a more preventive and anticipatory approach. When technologies are carefully selected, embedded in existing systems, and supported by human and institutional capacity, they can strengthen trust, cooperation, and compliance at the national, regional, and international levels. Ending on a hopeful note, which is, I believe, the whole objective of this webinar, much needed in these uncertain moments for arms control technology as well. Technology does not have to be a disruptive force for arms control regimes. Used wisely, it can be a powerful enabler for our shared objectives, preventing diversion, reducing armed violence, and contributing to international peace and security. So I thank you for this opportunity, and I am open to any questions that the audience may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silvia Paula. I think that puts us on a very continued, hopeful track. I love the emphasis on sustainability and also leveraging the systems that you already have in place, what expertise is already in the system, and finding ways to connect that. I think with that, we can start to wrap our discussion up with our last, but certainly not least, speaker. Rob Hunter Perkins is head of research at Conflict Armament Research, and he'll be discussing an overview of the different projects undertaken by CAR and their experiences in implementing technologies across different parts of the diversion prevention chain. So with that, Rob, I'll turn to you.
Thank you very much, Paula. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, yeah.
Yes?
Perfect.
Okay. Good. It'd be awkward for a conversation on technology if the technology failed me.
Yeah, we got you. Don't worry.
Yeah, particularly when everyone's done so well preceding me. Thank you very much for inviting CAR to be part of this panel. My objective here was to speak from the perspective of the organization's experience really on the front lines of countering weapon diversion. CAR works with national and local partners to physically document weapons that have been diverted to and recovered from illicit armed actors in conflict. And our investigative teams then work to trace the supply of those weapons and, where possible, identify how they came to be diverted. So in a way, and that's been for 15 years now, we've been working to support states practically in implementing provisions of the PoA, namely around effectively identifying, tracing and recording diverted weapons. And I think I'm echoing at least one previous speaker in saying that for us, the focus is on how technology can help with enhancing traceability of weapons and ammunition and looking to overcome some of the barriers and challenges to investigations that are common across our field operations. My intent was to try and act as a bridge between some of the innovative opportunities and ideas on the table in this discussion and the challenges we see on the ground to effective ITI implementation. Listening to previous speakers, I feel that job's already been extremely well done. So I might end up just echoing some of the pertinent comments that were made before me. Since CAR was founded in 2011, we've worked in more than 30 conflict-affected areas. And two of the things I wanted to highlight as an initial framing to this topic is that, number one, at least in our experience, a lot of the challenges that hold back effective weapon marking and tracing are not that high-tech themselves. They're often relatively prosaic, practical barriers. Adoption of emerging or existing technologies in that regard, therefore, are not necessarily silver bullets, but they might help us to crack or rethink quite old challenges. And then secondly, without meaning to overly generalize, the technological baseline in a lot of the frontline environments we work in and that are most heavily impacted by weapon diversion is not always that high. They're not necessarily technologically rich environments if you're talking about a remote border post that is vulnerable to a direct attack or to having the stockpiles raided. So it's important to look at practical, sustainable, and relevant ways in which these technologies can be applied. I'm going to talk a little bit about weapon marking, and then secondary will be tracing and record keeping. So, of course, everyone I think on this call will be familiar with what the ITI says around marking. It lays out the key requirements and guides states not only on what type of marks are necessary, but also how they should be applied, and affirms that marks should be recognizable, readable, durable, and as far as technically possible, recoverable. And one of the main common challenges that CAR encounters in the field is evidence of efforts to obliterate key identifying markings. Obliteration is the act of deliberately tampering with or removing marks, often serial numbers. Usually that has a motive of rendering, or at least the effect of rendering weapons completely untraceable. This, for example, is an assault rifle that a CAR field investigator documented in South Sudan in 2014. The serial number should be here on the forward trunnion. You can just make out the final digit is a 3, but the rest of it has been forcibly removed. And that's the case as of this morning when I looked for at least 650 assault rifles in our iTrace database. They are those that are flagged as having at least some level of deliberate marking obliteration, and that amounts to about 1 in 10 of the assault rifles we've seen on the field. This is a topic of a study that we're working on with the UNODA counterparts and with Dr. Bailey Henwood, who's a forensic specialist at Trent University in Canada. We're looking at a study on marking obliteration with the aim of publishing the outcome of our research in line with the deliberations of the open-ended technical expert group this summer. And we're looking to combine some of the field insights gleaned from our forensic and field specialists at CAR with consultations with UN member states and technical experts on this issue. One of the things that the survey and the research we've done highlights is that obliteration is a pretty basic and low-tech means of impeding tracing investigation in many cases. Some of the most common methods of removing marks were with power tools like a grinder, using drills to forcibly remove whole parts of the weapon where the mark has been applied, or even just using common hand tools like a chisel. The standard accepted method of serial number recovery in forensic science has been using a chemical recovery to physically strip layers of metal from the firearm to expose the underlying microstructure. This directly alters the state of the firearm and leaves behind unavoidable corrosion. An option to help overcome these issues is adapting and adopting approaches used in other sectors. And here I return to the idea, and actually I think it was something that Sarah raised in the first set of remarks, about bridging technical innovations from other sectors and try and apply them to our need for practical problem solving within the firearm sector. This is pictured as an eddy current kit. It was developed originally for vehicle registration numbers, but it has been tested and adapted and applied to the context of firearm marking recovery. And CAR's also tested it in a range of contexts with very positive results. If I try to explain in detail how it worked, it would become very obvious that I am not a forensic specialist myself. But in essence, what you can see here on the left is the forward trunnion with the damaged serial number is placed onto a magnetic base, and then a metallic tape is put over the obliterated area, and the machine runs an eddy current pulse through the base while a handheld scanner is passed across the firearm and the magnetic tape, which takes a reading, and then that is processed for the computer to read and convert into an image. That took longer for me to try and explain than it does for it to actually run. It's a very quick system. This is an example of a pistol with an aluminium insert plate. And in this case, you can kind of see that what's happened is it's been scraped to remove the marking, and you can see the damage on some of the polymer material on the right. Traditional chemical methods don't work on this at all because I'm informed it corrodes the aluminium material itself. But with the eddy current system, it was possible to restore and read the marking and the damaged microstructures that sit below the area that was stripped off the aluminium insert plate. So what this means is that not only are obliterated firearms don't need to be dismissed or considered useless from an investigative standpoint, but forensic integrity of the evidence can be preserved. This is something that we've been focusing on. The research is highlighted some challenges as well in marking practices in terms of marking obliteration recovery. One of those being the widespread use of laser marking, which has multiple benefits. It's very fast, it's very cost effective, but it also sits above the level of microstructure damage that you need to be able to dig in with the recovery methods. It's quite a shallow surface marking method. And different pieces of research, including a working paper carried out by UNIDIR last year, have highlighted that there are maybe some challenges, or the recoverability is more limited than with traditional methods. And it's a potential area of focus for the technical expert group to look at marking depth methods and deformation that are consistent with the ITI's requirements. There is, I think, huge potential in some of the technologies that were explored in the DTEC project and introduced by Sarah at the start of this event for innovative ways to add more unique information to weapons and ammunition, and to do so in ways that improve their resilience to efforts to make them untraceable. And one of those referenced in the study is chemical encoding. And this is something that I think sounds at the more sci-fi edge of the technologies that were under discussion in the paper, but is something that is actively being explored and the CAR is looking to implement for tackling small caliber ammunition. And its traditional untraceability once it's found outside of its original packaging. Chemical encoding in this instance involves creating an indelible tagant that is only visible under UV light, and it embeds a unique code containing traceable chain of custody information that can be extremely granular. And it can be applied either at the start of a supply chain, at the manufacturer or export point, or in a local armory. Now, this is a use case for ammunition. That's how CAR's been working with the technology. But it shows that there are wider use cases for consideration and applicability to other materials, and that some of the technologies outlined by Project Detect are readily applicable and becoming almost off-the-shelf solutions and options for states to consider in applying their PoA and ITI commitments. Moving on now to tracing and record keeping. The PoA and ITI both spell out the signal importance of tracing as a tool to address weapon diversion, and it's important to think of it not just as a kind of reactive step that happens after diversion has already taken place, but also as a forward-looking preventative tool as well. It generates information, it alerts partners in the transfer chain to entities or modalities involved in diversion that may have previously escaped notice, and through it you can build a picture to inform future risk assessments. And I was interested in the OAS presentation earlier about the voluntary center repository for storing some of this information on a regional basis. The ITI requires states to provide prompt, timely, and reliable responses to trace requests. And I would echo the previous speakers that effective record-keeping systems are an absolute prerequisite for tracing weapons that have been diverted. Put simply, when diversion occurs, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to establish what went wrong in the absence of effective records across the whole supply chain. Under the ITI, states are recommended to maintain manufacturer records for a minimum of 30 years and export-import records for 20. And one of the issues our work has repeatedly highlighted is that weapons have a long life cycle, and a large percentage of the weapons we trace exceed the minimum retention periods that are set out in the ITI or in regional instruments. And if that requirement is seen not just as a minimum floor to surpass in practice, then many of the weapons in illicit circulation can't be fully traced. And as you can see from the slide, 30% of the trace responses that were unsuccessful that we've issued since our founding, it's because of a lack of records. So I can only, I think somebody said earlier, it's not maybe the most advanced or sci-fi sounding technology that we'll discuss in the build-up to the OETEG in the summer, but CAR's work really affirms the point that went before me about the need for digital record-keeping systems as critical to effective ITI implementation. And in those systems, there should be no practical barrier why records could not be maintained indefinitely, but you can understand with a paper-based system why that may be less the case. So it only goes to show that the importance of the efforts that people like the OAS are taking. Now, when it comes to weapon registration and record keeping, there are a mix of national practices in play, from fully digitized to hybrid or largely manual systems. And the practical limitations of manual registration and record keeping systems are also pretty clear. If you recover a weapon from the scene of a crime or an attack, there's no way that you're going to be able to comb through thousands of physical logbooks to try and find the serial number. Likewise, if you're trying to detect and trace back weapons that have been diverted from a specific armory, then you need a system where information is easily retrievable and can be updated. And an additional barrier in CAR's work, at least, and in our experience, is the need for approaches to retrospective weapon registration that work in offline environments. So in Somalia, for example, where we've been working with national authorities since 2013, registering weapons that had been distributed previously to security forces around the country required us to have an offline capability, as well as mobile marking machines that could come out into the field with us. And as such, CAR's been developing a secure and intuitive inventory management system called RMAS. And through our work with RMAS, we developed features that were born directly from our experience on the ground, not just in Somalia, but in other low bandwidth and low technical capacity contexts. RMAS is designed to try and fill the gap between resource intensive and highly complicated systems and the more practical notebook-based approaches. It's very simple to use on the surface, but the tech under the hood is there for securing the system and for managing data handling and performance. And particularly what we've developed is things like a digital registration tool that sits on a customized app on the personal device of a police officer or professional device of a police officer. You can see in the bottom there. It enters all the critical information you need, including the ability to link records of images, something that is really important for subsequent identification and verification of weapons. And one of the big advantages of that app and that system is that you can record the information offline, so it works in remote environments and then can be uploaded to the centralized system later. So it can also be used to spot check weapons remotely, or equally even in an armory. We took quite an agile approach to developing the system and piloted it with police officers in Somalia over the last few years, even to the extent where we had a WhatsApp group where we could dynamically respond to feedback as it was coming in live. It's been piloted very effectively, and we see it as potentially having a wider application, a wider potential for application outside of that national context. So we're very happy to speak with other states who may have an interest in a tool like this. And with that shameless plug for future work, I will wrap my comments up there, Paolo, and return the floor to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rob. Those are such interesting use cases, and I think they bring us to a number of the issues that we face, a number of needs, as Sarah put it, that technology could help to fill. And with that, we have heard so many rich use cases, so many rich methodologies from the different speakers. This has been such a dynamic conversation so far. So thank you to the four of you. And now we can open the floor. If you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function within the chat. I see we've already received many. I think I'll begin by turning the floor over. I see Émile Lebrun is in the webinar from Tech for Tracing, and I think could add a valuable contribution to our discussion as well. Émile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to UNIDIR for the chance to take the floor. And congratulations on the timely and very informative discussion, which has already been very rich. I really appreciated the presentations and the emphasis that's been placed on how technology integration should cover the whole life cycle. I don't have any slides to share today, but very briefly, Tech for Tracing is an EU-funded new technology NGO lab founded 5 years ago and based in the Netherlands and Germany. We were created by arms control experts and work exclusively on supporting authorities to improve detection, documentation, and data collection on illicit weapons in support of mine action and arms control objectives. The core technology we develop and help our partners to deploy is AI computer vision. I just have a few brief comments. With regard to diversion identification, my main message would be that we can't do firearms tracing to identify trafficking and diversion without the effective documentation of seized and recovered weapons and ammunition. So this has to happen first, and it's a prerequisite for those other activities. And a number of speakers have already touched on this. So whether it's serial numbers, firearm brand and caliber, and other information, this information needs to be properly coded in conformity, ideally with reference tables, with synonym tables, as is mentioned already, and so on. Currently, this usually requires some form of technical knowledge. So in terms of what Sarah outlined at the beginning of this webinar, the question, what is the issue that technology is supposed to address? I would say one of the issues is not having good data, especially when it comes to seized and recovered weapons, which is what I'm particularly focused on. In other words, we can't really do tracing or even profiling without better documentation, even of weapons that haven't been tampered with. But for various reasons, we often miss structured, clean data sets in our sector, partly because of the skill sets needed for collecting the data, or the archaic ways of collecting that data, or just the technical difficulty of collecting it. For example, the ammunition case would be one important example there. So AI, and especially AI computer vision, is one technology for creating better data and for better documenting illicit weapons and ammunition. It's not a magic bullet and it can't do everything, but this is one thing that it can do very well. And maybe for those unfamiliar, just to say something about AI computer vision, it's a type of artificial intelligence that enables computers and systems to extract meaningful information from digital images and from videos and other visual inputs. Object detection and recognition is based on the visual appearance of objects, their shape, and their surface reflectivity as they interact with light in different wavelengths. And this can be combined with complementary technologies like optical character recognition to extract alphanumeric data from images of weapons. So we see this technology already being developed successfully in the mine action area. And as we have one foot in the mine action community and one foot in the counterproliferation community, we can see clear potential contributions that this technology can make in the arms control domain. At Tech for Tracing, we also see our role as helping our beneficiaries separate the reality from the hype of and the overpromise of what AI can do, which is a real issue when it comes to commercial tech providers. I won't go into the portfolio of projects that we're working on. Visitors can go to our website, techfortracing.org. But I would flag that we're about to release a research and policy brief under the EU project Automated Arms and Ammunition Mapping, which focuses on the use of artificial intelligence computer vision in X-ray and CT scanners to detect weapons. What is the current state of play of the performance of those systems? What are the key issues for ensuring that this technology continues to improve and become as effective as it can be in detecting illicitly manufactured or trafficked and diverted firearms? And if I can, I'll add a link to that webinar in the chat. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to take the floor.
Thank you, Emil. I think there's a common thread that runs throughout of what are the practical steps that we can take to move forward on these technologies. And it's great to hear how Tech for Tracing is taking this on. We have a number of questions in the chat, but I will start by exploiting my privileges as moderator to ask just a quick fire round from everybody. Given that this is setting up states in preparation for the OETEG, do you have one quick main element or one quick recommendation that you'd want states to take from your example into the discussions in June? We can start with whoever's feeling brave. Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to go first. I think I already highlighted mine in my slides. The one that immediately comes to mind would be looking at marking practices, depth and deformation with review to the ITI's requirement or recommendation that marks are made as far as technically possible recoverable. There is probably benefit of a guidance and a standardized guidance about what depths are most easily recoverable and under what circumstances. So I think that's an interesting area to look at.
I can jump in next. I would also actually reiterate something I very briefly mentioned towards the end of my presentation. I think also answers one of the questions that we received in the Q&A. But I think it's also making use of such a forum for sharing, practical lessons learned, what technologies are or have been used. So already in this forum, we've heard a lot of great examples. I'm sure they're not the only ones. So having really a place where different actors can share, not just states, of course, but other entities can also share these lessons learned, how technology has been adopted, how they've worked in practice, methods of adoption, but also that broader ecosystem that has enabled the technology to be successful and to be successfully implemented. As what we've heard from everyone is that technology is not the end all, the be all, and you need this broader frameworks and infrastructure around it. So kind of all of these steps and all of these elements that enable the technology to function.
I guess I can go next. It's hard to not sound repetitive when we had like such a enriching presentations by everyone. I think on a more objective level, it's to look at dual use materials and maybe what it was developed in terms of in other realms. Like if we think about non-proliferation, there's more that has been developed there on how to counter the illegal use of dual-use materials. And I think for some of the trends that were not discussed today, but with 3D printing, ghost guns, some of these issues, we will have to adapt how we have been thinking on, on conventional arms side, on how to address, because not everything will be able to be marked. So we have to adapt the approach to counter diversion when we are considering that now we're going to have more possibilities of illegal manufacture. So it's not only about the supply chain, but it's also looking at how we can counter illegal manufacture and looking at the pre-manufacture stage. And I think there is more to be learned from other fields that have been dealing with that type of challenge for a long time. But also I want to echo what everyone has already said. The technology cannot be looked as a standalone solution. So it would be important for the group to consider all these other variables that have to be in place for the technology to be successful. And I think coming from the regional perspective, it's also to recognize that regional diversity. So it's not an equal field when we're talking about the use of technology. There is a lot of different resources from countries. And I think it's important to not exclude certain countries from the conversation, because they will have valuable perspectives on how the technology can be used and if it is viable and feasible for them to use the technology. So bringing that regional perspective, bringing the national level perspective is quite key.
That's excellent, Pierre. Thank you. Silvia, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. It's just, I would say two key things that I think one of the speakers that went before us, Emil, mentioned, is the traceability and of how technology helps us to trace these weapons, but also I would say the using technology, preventing diversion through the entire life cycle of smaller arms and light weapons, which is also something that Pierre mentioned. So it's just, I wouldn't want to be repetitive, but I would like to highlight those two aspects that technology can help us in a complementary fashion to all the other frameworks and institutional areas that we must have for effective prevention of diversion. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia Paola. I see our panelists are very talented at multitasking, and many have been answering the questions in the chat, which I hope will be visible to all. There are just a few that I think I want to pull on a little bit further. Sarah, I see you've provided an initial response to this question, but I know several of the other panelists have also encountered systems that are mostly handwritten systems. And how you've dealt with that challenge. Are there specific technologies that you recommend in those contexts? This could go maybe OAS or maybe CAR.
Yes, I can take on that one. In terms of our experience, unfortunately, we haven't found a solution yet that will allow us to expedite the process. We have been working with countries still in a manual way of digitizing the information. And that's because, of course, there are technological solutions for us to be able to digitize the information, like to read through it and have it on, like if it's a paper, to have it on a file to extract the data. But it's not really about that. The information sometimes was not registered in the way that now the system operates, right? You're also like, technology is a way of streamlining processes, as I said. So if those processes, that legal framework was not clear from beforehand, you have to adapt and adjust the data. So, the classification of the firearms, if sometimes it's not all the information that it was encapsulated there. So how do you keep better records? So it's a way of also improving the records. So it's not only about scanning the information and having it like, imported to the system. Sometimes you do have to work through the data and harmonize it and improve it. And that's still a manual process. So we have not, unfortunately, a solution or any insights to give on that, on how we can make that quicker. I don't know if Rob has something that he can share, and hopefully we can use it here as well.
No, I only wish I was racking my brains trying to think of a solution that's currently on deck that I'm familiar with, but nothing is springing to mind. It does feel like a gap.
Maybe by the time the next webinar series comes around, we will have solved it. There are several other fascinating questions in the chat. I know there's some typed up responses. Unfortunately, we are running low on time. I wish I could keep you all for another hour or another hour and a half. But all that's left on my end is to say thank you for this dynamic dialogue and the excellent questions. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the participants who joined us not only today, but also in the previous two sessions. The webinar series has been enriching and has brought a lot of interesting issues to the table that I hope states will be able to carry into the OETEG discussions in June. The webinar series, as has been mentioned, could not have been possible without the generous support of Germany. Germany, very kindly, beyond their support, also provided us opening remarks at the very beginning of the series. And so now, to come full circle, I think it's only appropriate to hand the floor over to Germany to give closing remarks. So with that, I'd like to invite Michael Geisler, who is a political coordinator at the Permanent Mission of Germany to the UN in New York, to close us out with some closing remarks. The floor is yours.
Hi, Paula. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Wonderful. Dear Paula, dear Ivor, dear briefers, excellencies, dear colleagues, let me start by thanking you, first of all, to you, Paula, for guiding us excellently through today's webinar, but also to the briefers for sharing some very interesting, thought-provoking, and insightful presentations. So following up on what Rob has said, this is really, you're setting new standards. This is one of the very few UN webinars or video conferences that I've experienced without any technical glitches. So really thank you for doing this. It has been a pleasure, and we feel as government of Germany very proud to have financed this webinar series. Over the past 3 sessions, we've explored how emerging technologies are shaping the fight against proliferation of small arms and light weapons. We gained a clear understanding of the risks posed by innovations such as polymer-based manufacturing, modular weapons, craft production, and 3D printing. At the same time, we've seen how these technologies can be harnessed to counter diversion and enhance accountability. As a diplomat working in the UN, I can say that these webinars have been extremely insightful. They not only provided us with the relevant technical knowledge, but also translated it into actionable, forward-looking steps and measures that the international community can adopt to tackle the enormous challenge of small arms and light weapons proliferation. In other words, these webinars provide a solid foundation for our discussions at BMS 9 and within the OETEG in June. Before I conclude, I wanted to make 2 very short final points. This webinar has once again highlighted the importance of integrating civil society, academia, and industry in policy processes and making the most of their expertise and perspectives. For the success of the BMS 9 and the OETEG, it is essential to ensure their broad participation, and we will continue to seize every opportunity to encourage this. And on a broader scale, please allow me to reiterate that Germany remains committed to the fight against small arms and light weapons, may it be through funding projects or strong political engagement. If elected to the Security Council in June, Germany will ensure that the fight against the proliferation of small arms, light weapons, and ammunition continues to receive the attention it deserves. I thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the support and for these wonderful closing words. With that, Thank you to all of the participants, to our panelists who gave such expertise and such a richness to our discussion, and to all of the people who have joined us today. There are still a lot of really interesting open questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take them today, but as I've mentioned, there's a written output coming, and we'll try to keep these questions in mind so that we can give as broad of an overview and as rich of a text as we can to answer these questions. So keep an eye out for that. And the only thing left to say is good luck to everybody participating in the OETEG moving forward. We're hopeful that it will be a productive process indeed. So thank you, everybody. Good rest of the morning, good rest of the evening, wherever you are. And hello and goodbye from Geneva.